This may come as a surprise to anybody who's just stumbled upon my YouTube channel, or perhaps even watched more than a few videos over the past year or so, and would certainly most likely come to the conclusion that Mark really likes to paint military miniatures, and every once in a while he builds a Great War biplane or triplane. That's what he does in the hobby. There'd be no reason to think much of anything else or otherwise, but believe it or not, my passion, real passion as a kid, a long time ago, was cars, specifically racing cars, specifically Grand Prix Formula One cars from the golden era when I was a kid. At least I always think that way. We often identify with the heroes and sporting events of our childhood or youth. And for me, that was the early, mid, late 60s. And Formula One was something that I followed with a passion. Kind of hard to do that in long before the age of the internet or things like that from the United States. But needless to say, I really liked then building model cars and moved into slot cars, the mania of slot cars, which sort of rose and fell in the 60s. Much, much later on then, I decided when I returned to hobbying that my first step long before I got back to Great War airplanes and then military figures were scratch-built slot cars. And what I wanted to do was build Grand Prix cars from the era. And that led to something that was a double benefit. I think the reason I liked the slot Grand Prix cars of the early to mid 60s, the half-tonner era, 1.5 liter engines is all they were, about 90 cubic inches in displacement, and some of the greatest drivers that the sport has ever seen. And that led to discovering an artist, craftsman, fellow who ran a shop building accessories for slot cars, Mark Tyler and Immense Miniatures. And before long, we got to know each other. I had, of course, been scouring the internet for accessories to build these scratch-built cars for proxy racing, and somehow I talked Mark into making replica driver figures from my favorite era, the half-tonner era, 1961 to 65. And so needless to say, those were the cars I was going to build because I could pop one of his brilliant little figures in there. And this was my entry in the last proxy series I administered, a 1961 Lotus 21, and driven by Jim Clark, one of the greatest Formula One drivers of all time. In my book, the greatest, but that's always open to debate. And here is the wonderful little figure that Mark Tyler had, and his wife Heidi. They were a team in terms of sculpting and production, and then out they come in resin, and I painted Jim up and put him in this Lotus 21. The body shell by the incomparable Dave Jones, and the chassis and all those other things scratch built. The very first figure from that era that I managed somehow to lobby Mark to make was Graham Hill. I thought Graham was my favorite driver. Jim was the best of the bunch, but I really liked Graham Hill's panache, and of course he's very distinctive, sort of an Errol Flynn look, I think. There he is, and here he is in a BRM P61 in 1963. the model that was introduced just before the P2, the successful P261. And so there is Graham Hill in another Proxy series car that I built. Body, a vintage Supershells body modified to look like the P61. And then, yes, another great driver, another world champion, John Surtees from England. And here he is in the 1964 Ferrari 158, where he just edged out that season. The real John Surtees just edged out Graham Hill for the championship. By the way, Jim Clark during the half-tonner era was world champion in 62, 63 and 65. Graham Hill took the championship in 1962. John Surtees won the championship in 1964 in this car. And this again is a vintage Supershells shell made by a company in England. It's on a Penelope pit lane brass chassis, scratch-built accessories, and of course the wonderful John Surtees figure by Immense Miniatures. And then finally, if you saw the movie Grand Prix, the BRM team started the season, that was actually 1966, the first year of the return to power. And they did a carryover of the P261 with a bored-out V8 engine. And it was Jackie Stewart's first year with the BRM team. His teammate was Graham Hill, who'd been with BRM for 5 or 6 years at that point. And again, a lovely driver figure, full figure that I managed to get into this scratch-built chassis. There he is, probably sitting a little bit too low. Now, Jackie Stewart is a very small fellow, probably tops out at 5'5" if he makes it that high, but probably should be on a seat cushion there, just a little bit higher. Now, my homage and my remembrance of the Immense Miniature figures comes because, as some of you may know, I had this project to build this car of my youth, a static model, a 1/25th scale IMC Ford GT40 Mark I. Of course, it doesn't come with a driver figure. Well, the build hasn't turned out nearly as successful as I wanted. It's going to go together, but it's going to be a little bit off center and off balance. The main components just don't fit together. But I was able, with some pleading and to get Mark to look in his stash, and he found a resin figure for me, generic driver, which I did some surgery on to get him in there. And that reminded me how much I've appreciated the Immense Miniature figures, learning how to paint, a little bit about figure painting. And I did this guy in a bit of a hurry because, frankly, when that door is on, you're not going to see a whole lot of him. At least that's my reasoning. But we will get this GT40 completed. And I think some of the tips or techniques that I learned and use with my military figures and pilots, I first practiced on these wonderful driver figures from Immense Miniatures. So thanks, Mark, and thanks everybody who's watching. Take care.